At exactly 9:45 on a quiet Friday evening, Margaret Collins was finishing paperwork at the oak kitchen table in her farmhouse when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, expecting one of her managers to ask a last-minute question about the wedding preparations. Instead, the number was unfamiliar. She answered with a calm greeting. "Mrs. Collins?" a hesitant woman asked. "My name is Olivia. I'm the wedding coordinator for your daughter Emily's ceremony tomorrow." Margaret smiled faintly. Emily had insisted on hiring her own planner after becoming engaged to Lucas Carter, whose wealthy family believed every celebration should look as if it belonged in a magazine. Margaret hadn't minded. She wanted her daughter to have the wedding she dreamed of. "How can I help you?" she asked warmly. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt strangely heavy. "I'm very sorry to make this call," Olivia finally said. "Emily and Mrs. Whitmore have updated the guest list. They've decided it would be best if you didn't attend tomorrow's wedding." Margaret blinked. "I'm afraid they believe your presence may create an uncomfortable atmosphere." The words landed softly, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. She slowly removed her reading glasses and looked through the kitchen window. Across the lawn stood the magnificent event barn glowing beneath hundreds of warm string lights. 20 years earlier, she and her late husband Henry had built the property from empty farmland into the county's most respected wedding venue. Tomorrow's wedding would take place there, or at least, that had been the plan. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, an unexpected feeling settled over her. Not anger, but perfect clarity. "I understand," she answered quietly. Olivia sounded relieved. "Thank you for being so understanding." Before the planner could end the call, Margaret spoke once more. "Would you do me one favor?" "Of course." "Please tell Emily something." "What should I say?" Margaret's voice remained calm. "Tell her she has just uninvited the owner of the venue." Olivia fell silent. Margaret continued. "While you're at it, remind her that I also own the catering company preparing tomorrow's dinner, and the floral business that designed every arrangement inside that barn." The line became completely still. I didn't know," Olivia whispered. "I know you didn't." Margaret wished her a pleasant evening and ended the call. For several minutes she remained seated, staring toward the barn where hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, flowers, decorations, and food waited for tomorrow's celebration. Emily had spent months changing. Whenever Lucas's parents visited, she asked Margaret to stay in the farmhouse instead of greeting the guests. She joked about Margaret's practical boots. She encouraged her to wear nicer clothes. She even suggested hiring someone else to speak with vendors because, in Emily's words, appearances matter. Margaret had ignored every comment. Love often overlooked painful things. But tonight was different. Her daughter had decided she wasn't elegant enough to attend her own wedding, yet she still expected to use everything her mother had spent decades building. Margaret slowly stood and slipped on her jacket. Outside, the cool evening air carried the scent of fresh roses planted along the walkway. She unlocked the reception hall and wandered between perfectly arranged tables. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers. White roses and eucalyptus-filled handmade centerpieces created by her own employees earlier that afternoon. Everything looked flawless. Henry would have smiled proudly. They had sacrificed vacations, weekends, and countless sleepless nights to create this place together. Every wooden beam had a memory. Every flower bed reminded her of his hands working beside hers. She walked into the commercial kitchen. Chefs had already prepared tomorrow's expensive menu: prime beef, fresh seafood, homemade desserts, enough food for 150 guests. Margaret quietly turned off the lights. Then she locked every refrigerator, every storage room, and finally the main entrance. Using her master access panel, she deactivated every electronic code connected to the venue. Her phone buzzed. A message from Olivia appeared. Mrs. Collins, please tell me you were joking. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she opened the employee group chat. Her fingers typed only one short message. Tomorrow's event has been canceled. Everyone will receive full pay. Thank you for your hard work. Enjoy the weekend." Dozens of confused replies appeared almost instantly. She closed the phone without reading them. Back inside the farmhouse, Margaret prepared a cup of chamomile tea. She carried it onto the porch and watched the lights glowing across the empty venue. For the first time in months, she wasn't worried about pleasing anyone. She wasn't wondering whether her clothes embarrassed Emily. She wasn't trying to fit into someone else's world. She simply sat beneath the stars, listening to crickets sing across the fields. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring chaos, but tonight, for the first time in a very long while, her heart felt strangely peaceful. Margaret awoke before sunrise to the soft sound of birds outside her bedroom window. For a brief moment, the day felt ordinary. Then her phone began vibrating across the nightstand. One call, then another. Within minutes, the screen was flooded with missed calls and urgent messages. She ignored them all. Instead, she made her bed, showered, and dressed in a comfortable navy sweater and gray slacks. She brewed fresh coffee and watched the first rays of sunlight spread across the fields outside. Only after pouring herself a cup did she finally pick up her phone. 16 missed calls. Most were from Olivia, several were from Emily. Margaret calmly returned her daughter's call. Emily answered before the first ring had finished. "Mom," she shouted, "what is happening? Olivia says nobody can get inside the venue. The access codes don't work, and every entrance is locked." "I know," Margaret replied evenly. "I disabled them last night." There was complete silence. "You... what?" "I closed the property." Emily's breathing became quick and uneven. "The ceremony starts this afternoon. The decorators are waiting outside. The musicians can't unload their equipment. Open the doors right now." Margaret took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "I'm afraid I can't." "You have to." "No, Emily, I don't. You can't cancel my wedding because of one misunderstanding." Margaret looked through the kitchen window toward the quiet venue. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Her voice remained calm. "You asked someone else to tell your own mother she wasn't welcome at her daughter's wedding. That was a decision, not a mistake." Emily hesitated. "Lucas's mother thought it would be awkward." "So you agreed?" "I didn't want anyone feeling uncomfortable." Margaret nodded to herself. "Apparently, that included me." Before Emily could answer, another voice interrupted. It was sharp, polished, and dripping with forced politeness. "Margaret, this is Diane Whitmore." Margaret recognized Lucas's mother immediately. "Good morning, Diane." "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," Diane began. "Wedding planning has been stressful for everyone. Emotions are running high." "I see. I'm sure Emily never intended to hurt your feelings." Margaret remained silent. Diane continued. "Now, if you'll kindly unlock the venue, we can all move past this unfortunate misunderstanding." Margaret smiled faintly. "Diane, may I ask you something?" "Certainly. When you told Emily I didn't fit the image your guests expected, I never said that. You didn't have to." Another long silence followed. Finally, Diane sighed impatiently. "The point is that we have influential guests arriving from several states. Delaying this wedding will embarrass everyone." Margaret set her coffee mug on the table. "You seem worried about embarrassment." "Naturally. I spent 20 years building that venue with my husband. Every brick, every flower bed, every business connected to it exists because we worked for it." Her tone remained perfectly steady. "If I am considered an embarrassment, then my businesses clearly aren't appropriate for today's celebration either." Diane's polite mask disappeared instantly. "This is ridiculous." "No. This is childish." "No. This is revenge." Margaret shook her head. "This is a boundary." Diane's voice hardened. "If necessary, we'll enter the property ourselves." "I'm afraid that would be trespassing." "You wouldn't dare call the police." "I hope I won't have to." Margaret ended the call before Diane could respond. The farmhouse became wonderfully quiet again. She carried her coffee onto the porch just as another wave of vehicles arrived at the estate entrance far down the driveway. From the distance, she recognized Emily's white SUV. A black luxury sedan pulled in behind it. Then another. Guests had started arriving far earlier than expected. Margaret watched from across the property as figures gathered outside the locked iron gates. Several people tried entering security codes. Others pulled on the handles. Nothing moved. Her phone buzzed again. Olivia. This time she answered. Mrs. Collins, the planner said breathlessly. I'm begging you. Is there anything we can do? People are arriving and everyone is panicking. Margaret felt sympathy for the young woman. This isn't your fault. I've never experienced anything like this. I know. Olivia lowered her voice. Emily is crying. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Part of her wanted to drive down there, unlock everything, and pretend none of this had happened. That was the instinct every mother carried, to protect, to forgive, to sacrifice. But another voice inside reminded her how easily her kindness had been taken for granted. If she gave in now, nothing would change. Emily would simply learn that disrespect carried no consequences. I'm sorry, Olivia. So, that's your final decision? Yes. After ending the call, Margaret walked through the quiet farmhouse, gathering a few personal belongings, a weekend bag, 2 novels, comfortable clothes, her favorite hiking boots. Years earlier, she and Henry had purchased a small cabin beside a peaceful mountain lake. Whenever life became overwhelming, they escaped there together. Today she needed that place more than ever. As she zipped her travel bag closed, shouting echoed faintly from the distant entrance gates. She didn't look back. Some storms weren't hers to calm anymore. Margaret carried her overnight bag to the front porch, but before she could place it in her car, she heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching across the gravel road. She looked toward the entrance. Emily's white SUV had somehow made its way to the secondary gate near the farmhouse. Behind it sat a sleek black sedan belonging to Diane Whitmore. Both vehicles stopped abruptly. Emily jumped out before the engine had even gone silent. Her satin robe fluttered in the morning breeze, and half-finished curls framed her tear-streaked face. Hours before she was supposed to walk down the aisle, she looked nothing like the joyful bride Margaret had imagined raising. Without saying a word, Margaret walked slowly toward the locked gate. Lucas followed Emily, keeping several steps behind. His shoulders were slumped, and his expression revealed pure exhaustion. He looked less like a groom preparing for his wedding than a man trapped between 2 families at war. "Open the gate," Emily demanded the moment Margaret came into view. "Good morning," Margaret replied quietly. "This isn't the time for greetings." Lucas cleared his throat. "Mrs. Collins, could we please talk?" Margaret nodded. "I'm listening." Emily gripped the iron bars tightly. "The decorators are waiting. Guests have already started arriving. Reporters from the local society magazine are there too. Everyone is asking questions." "I'm sure they are." Emily stared at her in disbelief. "Mom, this has gone far enough." Margaret met her daughter's eyes. "It ended last night." Lucas stepped closer. "We know feelings were hurt." "Hurt?" Margaret repeated gently. "Your wedding planner called to tell me I wasn't welcome at my own daughter's wedding. I would say hurt is a very small word." Emily looked away. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "No? She struggled to finish the sentence. "I didn't want anyone judging us." Margaret smiled sadly. "So you decided they should judge me instead." Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. Lucas reached into his jacket pocket and removed his checkbook. "If this is about money," he said, "I'll pay for everything. The venue, the food, the flowers, whatever it costs." Margaret glanced at the checkbook before looking back at him. "The catering alone is worth nearly $30,000. Lucas swallowed. "The flowers cost another 15. His confidence faded. "I don't have access to that much today." "I know." Diane suddenly stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "This has become absolutely absurd." Margaret turned toward her. "Has it? You are humiliating respectable people." "No." "You are destroying Emily's future." "No." "You are punishing everyone because your pride was wounded." Margaret's expression never changed. "I'm refusing to reward disrespect." Emily's voice cracked. "Mom." Tears rolled freely down her cheeks now. "I'm sorry." Margaret listened. "I shouldn't have let Diane influence me." She took a shaky breath. "I should have spoken to you myself." Margaret remained silent. Emily continued desperately. "Please, I'll fix everything." "How?" "I'll tell Olivia to put your name back on the guest list." Margaret looked at her for several long seconds. So now I'm invited? Emily nodded quickly. You can sit in the front row. Margaret shook her head. No. Emily blinked. What? No, thank you. I don't understand. You aren't inviting your mother because you want her beside you. Margaret's voice was gentle but unwavering. You're inviting the owner of the venue. Emily's face turned pale. That's not true. Isn't it? No one answered. The silence itself became the answer. Margaret slowly reached into her coat pocket and removed a small velvet jewelry box. She carefully placed it on the stone pillar beside the gate. These belong to your grandmother. Emily stared at the box. I wanted to give them to you while we were getting ready together. This morning, fresh tears spilled down her face. You still deserve to have them. Emily reached through the bars and picked up the box with trembling hands. I never wanted to lose you. Margaret's eyes softened. Then you shouldn't have treated me as something you needed to hide. For the first time that morning, Lucas spoke honestly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins. Margaret looked at him. I should have stopped this before it went so far. I appreciate you saying that. Emily suddenly slammed her hand against the gate. If you leave now, she cried, everything will fall apart. Margaret nodded sadly. It already has. She turned toward her car. Behind her, Emily called out one final time. Please, Mom. Margaret stopped for only a moment but never looked back. I hope one day, she said quietly, you understand that love without respect cannot survive. With those words, she climbed into her car. As the engine started, she drove down the quiet country road toward the mountain cabin she and Henry had once loved. In the rearview mirror, the figures at the gate grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely. Margaret didn't know what would happen to the wedding. For the first time in years, she realized it was no longer her responsibility. Margaret drove for nearly 2 hours before reaching the small lakeside cabin she and Henry had purchased many years earlier. Hidden among towering pine trees, it had always been their refuge from the demands of work and daily life. Every corner of the little house held memories of laughter, quiet evenings, and dreams they had shared before illness took him away. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of cedar wood and old books welcomed her like an old friend. She opened every window, allowing the cool mountain breeze to flow through the rooms. The gentle sound of waves brushing against the shore filled the silence. For the first time in months, Margaret felt as though she could breathe without carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. She placed her phone on the kitchen counter and switched it to silent mode. Outside, she sat on the porch with a simple lunch and watched the sunlight dance across the calm water. Somewhere in the distance, birds skimmed over the lake while a fishing boat drifted peacefully near the opposite shore. It was impossible to imagine that only a few hours earlier, panic had consumed the wedding venue. Around mid-afternoon, curiosity tempted her to check her phone. More than 80 missed calls appeared on the screen. There were dozens of text messages. Some came from Olivia, apologizing repeatedly for everything that had happened. Others came from Lucas, asking if there was still any way to save the day. Many were from numbers she didn't recognize. Some messages were polite, while others accused her of being selfish and cruel. A few blamed her for embarrassing 2 respected families. Margaret quietly locked the phone again. She had no desire to argue with strangers who knew only one side of the story. Later that evening, Olivia left a voicemail. Mrs. Collins, the young planner said with obvious exhaustion, they managed to find a community hall on very short notice. The ceremony happened there instead. It wasn't what anyone planned, but they're legally married now. Margaret listened without emotion. She hoped Emily and Lucas would eventually build a happy life together. Despite everything, she never wished unhappiness upon her daughter. She simply refused to sacrifice her own dignity any longer. The following morning, Margaret woke early and walked along the lakeshore carrying a cup of coffee. Henry had always believed the lake possessed a special kind of healing. Whenever business became stressful, he would smile and say, "Water has a way of washing heavy thoughts away." Standing beside the quiet shoreline, Margaret finally understood what he meant. For years she had measured her worth by how much she could give. She gave her time, her money, her energy, her forgiveness. She believed being a good mother meant always saying yes. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that love also required self-respect. Without it, generosity slowly became expectation. Expectation became entitlement, and entitlement eventually erased gratitude altogether. That afternoon, she returned to the cabin and baked a loaf of fresh bread using Henry's favorite recipe. As the warm aroma filled the tiny kitchen, she smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because her daughter had suffered, not because the wedding had failed, but because she finally felt free from constantly trying to earn appreciation that should never have required earning in the first place. She spent 3 peaceful days reading novels, fishing from the old wooden dock, and watching sunsets paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. No meetings, no deadlines, no criticism, just silence. On Tuesday morning, she packed her belongings and prepared to return home. Before leaving, she stood on the porch one last time. "This would have made you smile," she whispered, looking toward the lake as though Henry might somehow hear her. "I finally learned when to stop carrying everyone else." The breeze rustled gently through the pine trees. Margaret smiled. Whether it was memory or imagination, she could almost hear Henry's familiar laugh carried softly on the wind. She locked the cabin and began the drive back to the estate, unaware that one final confrontation still awaited her. 3 days after leaving the cabin, Margaret turned onto the long gravel driveway leading back to her estate. The familiar field stretched peacefully beneath the afternoon sun, and the wedding venue stood exactly as she had left it, quiet, beautiful, and untouched. She unlocked the farmhouse, unpacked her bag, and made herself a cup of tea before checking the business records waiting on her desk. The weekend had cost her nothing financially. The prepared meals had already been donated to a local family shelter. The fresh flowers had brightened hospital rooms and a nearby retirement home. Nothing had been wasted. As she smiled at the thought, a loud knock echoed through the house. Margaret looked through the window. Emily stood on the front porch. She looked completely different from the confident bride of only a few days earlier. Her elegant hairstyle was gone, replaced by a simple ponytail. Dark circles rested beneath tired eyes, and her expression carried none of the pride she had worn before the wedding. Margaret opened the door. "Hello, Emily." "We need to talk." Margaret stepped aside. Emily entered quietly and sat at the kitchen table where countless family dinners had once been shared. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "The wedding happened. I heard. It wasn't anything like we planned." Margaret nodded. Emily stared down at her hands. "People are still talking about it." "I'm sure they are." She sighed heavily. "Lucas and I were married in a small community hall. We had folding chairs, grocery store sandwiches, and a borrowed sound system." Margaret listened without interruption. "Diane hasn't spoken to me since the ceremony," Emily continued. "She blames me for everything." "And Lucas?" "He says we'll get through it, but things have been difficult." Margaret poured 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of her daughter. Emily wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "I've had 3 days to think." Margaret waited patiently. "I kept asking myself why you wouldn't forgive me." She looked up, tears filling her eyes once again. "Then I remembered all the times you stood beside me. When I broke my arm riding my bicycle. When I failed my college exams. When my first serious relationship ended. You never left." Margaret smiled gently. "I was your mother." Emily nodded slowly. "And when you needed me to stand beside you," her voice cracked, "I pushed you away." Silence filled the room once more. This time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered. "I don't mean because the wedding fell apart. I mean because I made you feel ashamed of yourself." Margaret studied her daughter's face carefully. There was no panic, no demands, no bargaining, only regret. For the first time since that phone call, the apology felt genuine. Margaret reached across the table and gently took Emily's hand. "I've waited a long time to hear those words." Emily wiped away her tears. "I don't expect everything to be fixed today." "It won't be. I know." She hesitated before asking one final question. "Can you ever forgive me?" Margaret smiled softly. Forgiveness is possible. Emily's face brightened slightly. But trust, Margaret continued, takes much longer to rebuild. Emily nodded without argument. I understand. Margaret stood and walked to the window overlooking the estate. Your father and I spent our lives building this place. Emily joined her. I know. I always imagined passing it down to you someday. Emily lowered her eyes. I don't deserve it. No, Margaret replied honestly, not yet. She turned toward her daughter. Last week I signed an agreement with a professional management company. They'll operate the venue from now on. Emily looked surprised. You're retiring? I've earned it. What will you do? Margaret laughed softly. I've always wanted to see Italy. Emily smiled for the first time. Dad always talked about taking you there. He did. Margaret looked toward the gardens where roses swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. For years I believed my happiness depended on making everyone else happy. She paused. I finally learned that peace begins the moment we stop allowing others to decide our worth. Emily quietly slipped her arm around her mother's shoulders. Neither woman spoke. Words were no longer necessary. Outside, sunlight bathed the gardens Henry had planted decades earlier. Inside, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt hopeful. Their relationship would not heal overnight. Some wounds required patience. Some bridges needed to be rebuilt one careful step at a time. But this time, both of them understood that love without respect could never truly last. And respect, once lost, had to be earned, not demanded. Margaret smiled as she looked toward the road stretching beyond the estate. For the first time in many years, the future no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a new beginning,